Continuing our conversation in regards to carbohydrate feeding strategies for athletes, as we mentioned in the first segment of this video, it really again comes down to the level of athlete that we're talking about and specifically the type of training that they're engaged in, both in terms of intensity and duration. So that's really what's going to be needed here in terms of how we go about calculating an athlete's carbohydrate requirements. Now, again, in general, all athletes, in my opinion, should be consuming more carbohydrate than what we often see in the general population, right? A lot of times, in general population, we're actually trying to maybe reduce carbohydrate intake because a lot of people just don't tend to be very active, so they're not really needing all of this extra fuel and energy if they don't put it to use, right? If they're not moving around, there really isn't a need for a high carbohydrate diet in, again, most people who tend to be a bit more sedentary. But from an athlete's perspective, usually complete opposite, right? They're usually very, very active. They're constantly relying on this kind of go-to fuel support for both intensity of training, but then also during competition periods as well. So regardless, all athletes should probably be consuming a level of carbohydrate intake that is anywhere from 40 to 60% of their daily calories coming from carbohydrate. So beyond that, then we can kind of get into more specifics, again, based on the level of training or competition that they're doing. So again, if we look at this slide, usually about 45 to 55%, maybe upwards to 60, again, percent of total daily calories should be coming from carbohydrate. This generally equates to about 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, not always. And then as we look at athletes engaged in more intense training, or if the volume of training exceeds just kind of normal daily level. So what I mean by that is if we're working with a cross country athlete who's running 50, 70 miles a week, they probably need at least 5 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. If not, maybe even upwards to 8 to 10 if we look at really, really high levels of training that you would see towards the end of a marathon training cycle or triathlete or anyone who's really doing multiple hours a day of pretty rigorous training that would maybe warrant a carbohydrate intake in that type of range. Again, this should be grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Sorry that I forgot the kilogram component. Here you can see it down on the table here. That's what that unit should look like. So again, just for generally active, kind of recreational athlete type of intensity levels, I think 3 to 5 grams per kilogram would suffice. Similarly, with mostly just strength and power type athletes, I think that's a fine level of carbohydrate intake. I don't think they need to be going really that far above that. But again, you can see here as we transition into more endurance type athletes and higher volumes of weekly training, then the carbohydrate intake is going to go up quite a bit, 5 to 8, if not even 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight during our really high intensity training blocks or kind of weeks of high volume training. So um, this figure or this table, excuse me, just kind of provides some additional information, then also provides a bit more context here in terms of what those training descriptors could look like. You can see in this table, the values are a little bit higher than what we saw in the previous ones. You can see even upwards to 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight per day at maybe the high end. But again, this is 4 to 6 hours or more of pretty intense training that would need to be done that would warrant a carbohydrate intake in that particular range. So that's a pretty, again, rigorous type of training that would be needed if you're going to recommend someone to eat that amount of carbohydrates. Not uncommon. You know, we see it in high level endurance athletes, triathletes, ultra distance runners, things of that nature. But your everyday athlete or, recreational runner who runs 3 days a week, they don't need that much carbohydrate. This would be sufficient here, right around that 5 to 7 range. We're going to come back to the recovery-based feeding strategies here shortly, but just a quick preview of that. It is important to also kind of focus on carbohydrate intake after that training session as well. And here you actually see it expressed as kind of an hourly rate. So we would actually want about 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour here as kind of the added descriptor in terms of an hourly rate of carbohydrate ingestion. And that's to really get a jump start on that glycogen resynthesis rate or process knowing that that process takes time, takes hours, takes days sometimes to fully kind of replenish glycogen levels within muscle and liver tissue. And so this becomes increasingly more important if we have two training sessions in a day or another training session the next day. You really kind of need to stay on top of that continual carbohydrate feeding and refeeding to ensure that glycogen levels are kind of staying as high as possible throughout different training cycles. If we have one distinct time point or competition that we know is on the weekly schedule, sometimes you'll see athletes even follow what's called a carbohydrate loading protocol, in which they really ramp up carbohydrate intake in the days or week prior to a race event or big competition to really try to maximize glycogen levels as much as physiologically possible. There's a couple different ways that this has traditionally been approached. The kind of old school way was to actually follow like a carbohydrate depletion protocol in which that athlete would kind of taper down their training, maybe do one last intense training session, and then they would intentionally restrict carbohydrate for, you could see here 7, 6, 5 days out from competition, and then ramp carbohydrate back up leading into race day. But in my opinion, it really isn't the most effective way to go about it. It kind of leads to some issues of athletes not feeling well, maybe some GI issues. And what we're learning now about gut health and gut training is that you actually kind of have to keep your stomach and GI system used to a high carb intake so that it's not really a shock to the system come race day. So what we see now is kind of a newer school approach where we actually keep carbohydrate intake pretty low and actually kind of titrate it up in the week leading up to that competition. So again, you can see here around 6 days out, 7 days out, kind of a moderate carbohydrate intake, and then really ramping it up leading up to race day, which you're probably getting close to that 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate in those days immediately kind of preceding that big race. So again, the rationale why here is that we really want to do everything in our power to maximize carbohydrate levels or those glycogen levels within the body to kind of help provide as much internal fuel as possible. The other kind of important context details here is that it really doesn't need to be done for a sport like basketball or for sprinting athletes, anything like that. This is really more reserved for pretty high level endurance athletes engaged in, I would say, half marathon type distances and beyond. So if you're out running a 5K, 10K, you probably don't really need to worry about carb loading that much as long as you're always consuming a moderate to high carb intake. I don't think you need to focus on much more beyond that. So the duration of the race event is kind of an important detail here, because what you'll also notice with carbohydrate loading is that you will also increase a pound or two of weight, mostly just water weight, because glycogen is a larger molecule, actually retains some cellular fluid. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Especially a thing or a race like a 5K or 10K, you're probably not glycogen depleted by the end of those races. So is it really worth being a couple pounds heavier for that race? Um, just to carry extra fuel and water weight that you're probably not going to need anyway. In my opinion, that really wouldn't be helpful. So for those kinds of athletes or those competitions, I don't really think we need to stress too much about these high level carb loading type protocols. As we get in closer to the competition itself, whether again it's a game, race, etc., you would really want to focus your carbohydrate intake at least like 3 to 4 or 5 hours before and kind of consuming more complex carbohydrate. There is some concerns of consuming things that are too sugary, too close to the competition, because again, you may get that rebound hypoglycemia effect. So that's why I think, if possible, moving that pre-competition meal about 3 to 4 hours prior to the event is probably ideal. That gives you a little bit more time to digest, absorb, transport those nutrients, specifically carbohydrate, to where it needs to go. But also keep in mind that that's still not really sufficient time to replenish glycogen levels. So if you're saving all of your carbohydrate intake for just the morning of or a couple hours before, you kind of missed your window. Really, that carbohydrate feeding strategy needed to be done a couple days prior to that event or game or race. Because as you get closer and closer, there's just not a lot of time to really make a lot of use out of that food and carbohydrate. So you, again, kind of missed your opportunity there. So with athletes, we really want to encourage this the night before, morning of, assuming there's several hours in between breakfast and whenever you're competing. Okay. Otherwise, as you get closer and closer, you're almost just utilizing things to really keep your stomach comfortable. So comfort foods, easily digestible, small snacks, things like that, just so you're not hungry or lightheaded or anything like that. So you want to just maybe sip on smaller drinks or small snacks. Because again, there's not much you could do that short of time frame to give you a lot of advantages. However, there are things you could do that would maybe hurt you if you eat a big meal and you're feeling lethargic, tired, sleepy, and like that going up to the game or competition period. Next, we kind of shift our focus to carbohydrate timing during a competition or game or anything like that. And so consuming exogenous carbohydrate sources can actually help us during, again, race events or intense games or matches, because you're providing that extra source of carbohydrate to kind of supplement internal glycogen stores and availability. And so that can delay the kind of point where we would see glycogen depletion or fatigue or anything of that matter. So sports drinks are a great source of carbohydrate during competitions. Very easily digestible. You're also getting fluids and electrolytes at the same time. So those are great options there. And in terms of amount of carbohydrate intake during competitions, usually we want anywhere from 30 to 60 grams per hour is kind of the sweet spot to maybe aim for. And then I'll show some recent data here in a minute that suggests for our extreme high level athletes that are really training and competing at a high level, we actually need to go probably beyond 60, if not 90 grams an hour on that high end. But again, for other team sport athletes or lower level endurance athletes, 30 to 60 grams per hour is probably sufficient. And you can see here by consuming that high carbohydrate intake during match and competition, you actually are able to increase carbohydrate oxidation rates during activity because again, you're providing that additional source of carbohydrate and glucose during competition. So you're providing extra fuel is kind of how you can think of it that would delay the onset of fatigue, delay the point of glycogen depletion, and hopefully providing additional energy source to maintain race pace, competition speed, intensity of effort, whatever kind of sport or event that we're talking about. So in this figure, you can kind of see again the race duration that we're maybe talking about, and then what the subsequent feeding strategy would be for kind of carbohydrate timing or intake. So if we're looking at an event that's like 30 to 60 minutes in duration, they probably don't really need any kind of carbohydrate source. It's too short of an event to worry about glycogen depletion. You're still going to have fuel in the tank. So just small sips of sports drinks or water would be sufficient. Maybe utilizing like a mouth rinse, carbohydrate mouth rinse strategy, which I'll circle back to here in a minute. But as we get into longer duration events, 60 minutes, so like 1 hour to 2 hour, then you can see now, okay, maybe 30 to 60 grams per hour would potentially be recommended here. And then as we get into the 2 hour, 3 hour mark, you could see even more important to increase carbohydrate intake during these types of activities. So again, this is certainly marathon or triathlon level distances or competition type. So that would warrant, again, that 30 to 60 grams per hour. Maybe at the highest level, we would consume that 90 gram per hour mark. The challenge is with exogenous carbohydrate intake is really how much can we digest and absorb through the stomach and GI system. So that's kind of the bottleneck or the barrier here in terms of how much carbs you can consume during races or competitions. It's how much can your stomach and GI system handle without any kind of GI distress where you get sick, nauseous, throwing up, diarrhea, anything like that when you kind of overload the stomach and GI system. So there is somewhat of a limit in terms of gastric emptying rates in terms of how much food and fluid can empty through the stomach into the intestines so that we can absorb it and kind of put those glucose molecules or sugar to work. So we have to be careful there of not overloading that And so there is kind of a peak limit there in terms of how much carbohydrate we can consume and then oxidize or use kind of during competition. And the peak is really kind of somewhere around that 75 to 100 grams per hour in terms of how many carbs we can kind of burn. And so we don't really need an ingestion rate too far above that because that just means we're consuming extra carbs that can't really be utilized to support energy production during those types of events. And then also you carry an extra risk of GI discomfort or upset during those kinds of activities as well. So that's kind of the limiter here. There are some recent studies that have highlighted literally some gut training protocols to get your stomach and GI system used to handling that amount and rate of carbohydrate intake. So it actually takes a bit of work to get your system used to, again, appropriately handling that rate and amount of carbohydrate intake. I mentioned there's some really, really recent research that's come out suggesting that even high level endurance athletes might want to go a little bit beyond the traditionally accepted level of 60 to 90 grams per hour. So this study actually kind of utilized some unique statistical modeling to kind of find out that actually despite a fairly moderate to high carbohydrate intake, it really wasn't enough to provide exogenous carbohydrate sources during male and female endurance athletes competing in a marathon, but then also trying to surpass the 2 hour mark. So these are very, very elite. These are top of the world caliber of runners, which would again potentially warrant a carbohydrate intake of beyond 90 grams per hour, which again is a lot. And so I would really only reserve that level of intake again for the elite marathoners that are again used to handling that. For us mere mortals, I think 30 to 60 grams would still likely be sufficient for most. Maybe 60 to 90 grams as we get into our higher level of competitors, but really reserving that high end intake amount to really the elite of the elites. But just some interesting data here. This is kind of an infographic that came with the abstract that was published in 2024 in the Journal of Applied Physiology. But they again kind of estimated carbohydrate oxidation rates in males to be upwards to 5 grams an hour, whereas females were about 4. So that's still a lot of carbohydrate per hour that they're oxidizing, which again, you can kind of see there why we would maybe need to recommend rates kind of above that 60 to 90 grams per hour mark to offset that level of oxidation and provide additional fuel sources. I mentioned one other unique strategy that we've seen here a little bit more in the last decade and a half is carbohydrate mouth rinsing. So just like the term implies, you're actually not swallowing and ingesting this carbohydrate source. You're literally just swishing it around the mouth and spitting it out. So you don't even swallow the sports drink or anything like that. You just kind of get it in your mouth and it actually triggers some receptors and kind of reflexes within the mouth and brain to kind of almost trick your brain into thinking it's getting incoming energy. And so it almost can respond with that assumption or with that intent in mind. So it increases this kind of central drive or motivation to maintain race pace, effort, intensity, even though we're not actually providing the body and our muscles with exogenous carbohydrates. So again, for our durations of less than 30 minutes, 60 minutes, I think mouth rinsing would be the way to go because then you're not worrying about any GI discomfort or upset or anything like that. So I think sports like, cross country or 5K, 10K type distances, or wrestling or anything like that, where you maybe need that kind of quick source or fake source, I should say, of carbohydrate, but you don't want everything else that could potentially come with it. And so there's been some interesting studies again showing that mouth rinsing can be an effective strategy of improving, kind of race performance or, time to exhaustion, overall work output, and things like that by just again swishing that sports drink or carbohydrate source around in the mouth without actually fully ingesting it. Now, as we transition into kind of our post-exercise feeding strategies, again, the window immediately following a race or competition is probably the best time to get the bulk of carbohydrate intake in because there's really two reasons for it. One, we just depleted glycogen stores through our competition, race, or whatever. So that's reason one. So our fuel stores are empty. Secondly, Our body, specifically our muscles and our GI system, are very much primed to utilize that source of carbohydrate immediately. So our muscles are more sensitive to uptaking that blood glucose in circulation and immediately starting the glycogen replenishment process. So again, our bodies and our muscles are very sensitive in that immediate post-exercise window. And so we want to take advantage of that to maximize glucose uptake and start that glycogen replenishment process as soon as possible. And so we see advantages of consuming carbohydrate immediately post exercise as opposed to delaying it, upwards to 2 hours or anything like that. So if we look at that 2 hour post exercise mark, our rates of glycogen synthesis are much higher if we provide that source of carbohydrate immediately post exercise, as opposed to delaying it. Here, you can see levels are much, much lower. If we extend this out over upwards to 4 hours, you can see not much difference at that time point. But as I mentioned, our bodies and our muscles are much more sensitive immediately post exercise. So this is the reason why you want to take advantage of it. And again, this is even more important for athletes participating in two-a-days, tournaments, multiple days of competition, traveling, anything like that. It becomes increasingly more important. If it's the championship game or race event, you don't have anything for weeks beyond that, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to worry too much about what you're consuming afterwards. Just enjoy the end of the season or the day. You're going to be fine. But if you got to wake up and do something intense the next morning or another 4 hours of training tomorrow, absolutely, let's get that recovery process started ASAP. You don't have to worry too much about this slide, but this is just kind of indicating some of those glucose transporters that are on the membranes of our muscle cells become kind of activated. And then again, this is what leads to that increased sensitivity and better ability to uptake glucose into the cell and take advantage of that post-exercise sensitivity to both glucose, but then specifically insulin, again, kind of helping lead to increased carbohydrate intake or uptake, I should say, and glycogen resynthesis as soon as possible. So that, again, is going to be a rate of carbohydrate intake of about 1 to 1.2, maybe upwards to 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour. Okay, so there's kind of a linear relationship there. If we, increase it from 1 to 0.5, you can see the rate of muscle glycogen synthesis is higher at this rate of intake as opposed to the 0.5 intake. But there is somewhat of a ceiling indicating that we can't just continually consume a ton of carbohydrate forever and get a greater and greater return on investment. There is kind of a cap that we see there. So again, maybe upwards to 1.5, but you probably don't need to stress of going too far above that. There are also some kind of synergistic benefits of adding protein to the carbohydrate. It also actually helps to increase even more glucose into the cell and again, better promote glucose uptake and glycogen resynthesis. And there's also kind of a twofold benefit here from the protein perspective. So you're also able to get protein into the cell more effectively, which also aids in the recovery process as well, as increased amino acid uptake will help kind of stimulate protein synthesis, which is helping to initiate kind of muscle repair and even muscle growth if that is the kind of desired training effect there. So again, kind of a win-win here. We can replenish used glycogen stores. So we restore our carbohydrate source of fuel, and then we also get protein in to help kind of the muscle repair, recover from training, maybe help stimulate muscle growth. Again, kind of a win-win across the board. There is also some evidence that even adding caffeine to post-exercise carbohydrate intake can also further help increase muscle glycogen resynthesis. You can see here at the 4 hour mark post-exercise, when we combine caffeine with our carbohydrate source, we get a greater glycogen resynthesis response as opposed to just carbohydrate intake alone. We even see that at the 1 hour mark as well. So again, you could even add some coffee in there, energy drink, whatever your dose or kind of poison happens to be, might again get some synergistic benefits there. This one I'm somewhat cautious about because again, we don't necessarily want to be ramping up a ton of caffeine intake throughout the day, especially if you had some kind of caffeine source before training or competition. You'd want to be a little bit cautious there of adding even more caffeine intake after the competition. And then certainly if this is later in the afternoon or day, we don't really want to be adding extra caffeine in because that could disrupt sleep. So kind of all in all here, again, carbohydrate really the go-to fuel source for high level athletes, especially endurance athletes in our intermittent kind of team sports. So making sure we're following kind of carbohydrate recommendations, 45 to 60% of calories coming from carbohydrate. And then I'd say usually around 5 to 8 grams per kilogram per day for most athletes. And then if we get into our higher level endurance athletes, then we're starting to go above the 8, if not 10, maybe all the way up to 12 grams per kilogram per day in terms of carbohydrate recommendations. But that's really, again, reserved for the highest level. And then we would also want to make sure that we're kind of consuming a high carbohydrate diet in the days leading up to an intense competition. Again, making sure if it's a long race or competition, we're incorporating some kind of carbohydrate during the race or competition or halftime. And then again, starting that carbohydrate refeeding really as soon as possible afterwards to kind of help get a jump on that glycogen replenishment process. So again, carbohydrate, very important. We'll talk in the next module about carbohydrate versus fat strategies or ketogenic diets and whether or not one might be advantageous over the other or some kind of myths and misconceptions around those two. So stay tuned for future videos if you want to learn more about whether or not ketogenic diets have any place here in terms of sports nutrition strategies for different athletes.